Welcome to Noronto Wants to Know with our host, David Donoghue. Our special guest today is Apostle Lachlan MacKay, who was our guest ministry last year and during our first e-camping experience. And we were really grateful for him doing absolutely everything he did for us last year. And we are absolutely thrilled to have him back again with us this year. So without any further ado, I am turning the show over to David and Lachlan.
Thank you very much, Scott. Appreciate all of your support and your technical support. And yes, I definitely want to echo what Scott just said about Locke's contributions to our program last year. He was, in fact, supposed to be our in-person guest minister at Noronto reunion up at Minettville last summer, but the world decided it would be a fun practical joke on us to cancel everything. But as Scott mentioned, he was still so supportive in helping us do some activities digitally last year through our first e-camping program. And I reached out to Locke a few weeks ago and said, you know, we have this tradition at Noronto Reunion where I do some interviews of our guest ministers and some other people who are there each year. And we didn't get a chance to do that last year. So I thought, let's do it this year. And he very kindly agreed. So Locke, I thank you so much for being here. Before I give you a chance to say anything, I'm going to read a little introduction for our viewers about who you are. Locke is a member of the Council of 12 Apostles, assigned to the Northeast USA Mission Field. He also serves as Historic Sites Director and Church History and Sacred Story Ministries Team Lead. A native of Independence, Missouri, Locke received a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and Russian Arts Studies from the University of Missouri, Columbia. He is active in the John Whitmer Historical Association, the Mormon History Association, and the Nauvoo, Illinois Chamber of Commerce. He co-authored A Time of Transition, the Kirtland Temple, 1838 to 1880. He was the winner of the John Whitmer Historical Association's Best Article Award for 1999. He also has published articles in Mormon Historical Studies, the Encyclopedia of Latter-day Saint History, the Journal of Mormon History, and Religion in Ohio, Profiles of Faith Communities. So Locke, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us here today. I know you get asked often to be on the Stephen Colbert show or the Conan O'Brien show. So we're grateful that when our producers reached out to you, you were able to make time to be with us here today. Welcome.
Thank you, David. This, of course, is a highlight, much more memorable than my Conan experience, I'm sure will be.
Locke, we always begin these interviews with some what I call icebreaker questions. But they're really, they're kind of beyond icebreaker questions. It might be more appropriate to call them just what they are, silly, nonsense questions. But we do put everything through this ordeal. So your first nonsense question of the day, Locke, is, does pineapple belong on pizza?
Most definitely. Don't even have to think about it.
Woohoo! There you go. I agree. All right. We're off to a great start. Thank you. I agree. There you have it, folks. If there is any dispute, you've heard it from an apostle. Pineapple does belong on pizza. Your second nonsense question of the day, Mickey Mouse or Bugs Bunny?
Maybe Bugs Bunny, but you know, I have not many memories from my childhood for some strange reason, so I'm not sure that I remember either of them well enough to.
Well, there really is no wrong answer to that question because they're both great. You gotta love Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny. And finally, your final nonsense question of the day, Locke, is which flavor of ice cream is the one true flavere?
Passion fruit with seeds.
Passion fruit with seed, and you were really quick to answer that.
Yep.
Wow, I haven't even heard of that kind of ice cream. That's a new one. Okay.
Got to go to Australia or Mexico.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's definitely a tropical option. Passion fruit is not easy to find in this part of the country, and I'm guessing it's probably not easy to find in Canada.
I have never seen it myself, that's for sure. Wow, I don't even know if I'd be brave to try that, but if that's your favorite, then I guess it's got to be delicious. Well, let's move on to some getting to know you questions. Can you tell us where you were born and where you were raised?
Yep, Jackson County, Missouri, which is, of course, where Independence is, but I was out in the county in a rural area. Went to Fort Osage High School, which, again, maybe 380 something in my graduating class, also relatively drawing from a rural area. So grew up on a farm. We were not farmers, but people farmed the land around us. My dad was an electrical contractor.
Oh, wow. Okay. And what got you interested in church history?
So I had grown up going to family reunions in places like Nauvoo, but I got to say I'd never really been captured by the story. But after I got out of University of Missouri, and I need to correct that bio, it's Russian area studies versus Russian arts studies.
Okay.
Although I'm really interested in art, I don't know anything about it, but I love it. But I thought I was going to work for the U.S. government. It was a really long interview process, and I needed to kill time. My mom worked for what was then Restoration Trail Foundation, now Community Christ Historic Sites Foundation. And I went to an activity with her where they were putting the Plano, Illinois Stone Church on the National Register of Historic Places. Her then supervisor, David Ettinger, recruited me to serve as an intern in Nauvoo, this historic sites internship program that we have. And I thought, if I'm going to be there for the summer, I had to learn something about this place. So I picked up Robert Bruce Flanders' Nauvoo, Kingdom on the Mississippi, and started reading. And by the time I was done, I was just captured by her story. So came to Nauvoo, spent the summer, then the second summer to Kirtland. And actually, even before I went to Kirtland, David was asking me if I would consider, if all went as planned, staying and becoming the first full-time site director in Kirtland, which I ended up doing. So Kingdom on the Mississippi and time in Nauvoo was really grabbed my attention.
Wow. Okay. That's actually a really neat story. I like how you weren't quite really maybe into it at one point, but faced the challenge of, if I'm going to be here, I need to brush up, and I might have to check out those resources myself. Locke, what would you say is a verse or passage of scripture that really resonates with you?
So I love the book of Acts, and particularly Acts chapter 2. I'm going to go with most of it because I understand it to be, and this is influenced a lot by Andrew Bolton's thoughts, but I think he's right. This idea that is the template for what we are trying to do as a church in the 1830s. So we're restorationists or Christian primitivists trying to restore what we understand from the New Testament. Acts so early in Christian history that people are still Jewish. So, for example, why are we living in gathered community in Kirtland? Because that's what's described in the book of Acts. Why are we passionate about the plight of the poor and trying to live all things common so the surplus of the wealthy can lift up the poor? Because that's what's described in the book of Acts. Why are we Christians with temples? Because that's what's described in the book of Acts. And why are we passionate about taking the gospel overseas? Because that's what's described in the book of Acts. So I'm going to go with most of chapter 2. But ask me tomorrow and it might be different.
Fair enough. Okay, we'll allow you some discretion on that for sure. I want to move on to some questions about what you do in the church, your role in the church, and since you are an apostle, which is sometimes a concept that is maybe difficult for people to wrap their heads around, can you give us a rundown what a day in the life of an apostle of Community Christ is?
Well, I can't speak to the others, so let me only talk about the days I live. And they've been strange ones during the pandemic. Nauvoo is a town of 1,100. We barely left for almost a year. We would get groceries, picking them up outside the store. And then Quincy, Illinois is about an hour away. That's our regional healthcare center. But other than those things, we almost never left. But a typical day. So today I spoke in Colorado for Greenwood Village, the congregation there. That's not particularly typical because normally I try and spend most of my time in my field versus in other parts of the country or the world. But I'm thrilled when I have the chance to do that. Last weekend, I spent a lot of time at Sunstone. Now, this was all online. Unfortunately, I was supposed to be in Salt Lake for Sunstone, which is a place that we connect with lots of folks who are or will become Latter-day Seekers. I was supposed to be there in person, ended up not able to go. But so going to sessions Friday and Saturday, their online presentations, spoke Sunday morning for the Salt Lake City congregation in their Sunday school with President Cram, taught Sunday school, and then spoke as part of the worship service, and then jumped in my car and drove to Independence. Since I'm traveling just a little bit now, that's about 4.5 or 5 hours, so that I could be there Monday to record a sermon that will be released sometime this winter. While I was there, I stayed at Heritage Plaza, one of our historic sites, and I spent a lot of time weeding and cutting down trees and brush
Wow.
and sweeping and cleaning. That's a regular part of my apostolic experience as well.
That's awesome. So you're a hands-on apostle.
Yeah, yeah. And the same is true in Kirtland and Nauvoo. If there's things to do, most of our volunteers went home. We have some incredibly passionate folks, particularly in Kirtland at the moment, who are putting in 70-hour weeks in the gardens and cleaning. But even with that, we have a desperate need for help, and all of our Nauvoo volunteers are gone. So, I'm often mowing or trying to write a paper or trying to write a chapter. I've been kind of struggling in the last few weeks because I had a writing project due in May
Oops.
that I was trying to finish up. I'm getting close. And unfortunately, I volunteered to present at a symposium in 2 weeks because the person putting it together was kind enough to speak at something we had done in Nauvoo. So I was trying to return the favor, which means I have to become an expert on the church in southwestern Iowa in the next 2 weeks.
Wow.
So it's a mix of research, of preparing to preach, of maintenance work, of working with historic sites. We're going to be planning to open in March, so we're starting to think about recruiting volunteers again. Sometimes working with seekers. It really is a fascinating mix. But I love it. I love it. It's an amazing privilege to be able to do.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing. Now, you also, in addition to being an apostle for the church, you serve the church in the capacity of church history and sacred story ministries team lead.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? And is there a distinction between church history and sacred story?
So the church history and sacred story team is, and again, as you mentioned, I'm the lead, but we have 3 world church historians, Ron Romig, David Hallett, and Barbara Walden. And they're all self-sustaining, so they do other things or are retired, but they're also world church historians. And also on the team are people like John Charles Duffy or Megan Edvilson or Rachel Killebrew or Peter Judd. And at times we put together articles for the Herald. At times we put together articles or kind of research papers for the First Presidency. For example, we're working on some things that will inform World Conference. We just did something on peace and Community of Christ as the part of the preparation for the nonviolence discussion. We're looking at the church and indigenous peoples. What we're really spending quite a bit of time on right now, though, is we have managed to fire up again the church's oral history. So Megan Edvilson is our oral history lead, and we have fallen behind significantly on capturing oral histories from retired church appointees and general officers. So we're making pretty good progress now on trying to catch up. But that means lots of research to prepare bios on the individuals that we then provide to the person who's going to interview. We put together some questions. Then we have to help with transcriptions. then kind of get it all put together. A lot of time spent on the permissions paperwork so that we actually can use the interviews once we're done. So that's a lot of what the team is doing now. Is there a difference between church history and sacred story? This is also a question I might answer differently tomorrow, but I think not. I love the idea, and this was very true of the church in the 1830s, and I think we've kind of lost it, but I occasionally try and reclaim it. I love this idea that the sacred story didn't end with the last book of the New Testament, that we are also living the sacred story. And I love to contemplate what I would do differently if I thought people might be reading in 2,000 years about my actions or your actions. How are we going to come out in this story? Are we the sheep or the goats? Or so I like to think that church history and sacred story are one and the same. Now, some people might hear that wrong when I talk about sacred story. We've not so much in recent years, but in the past had challenges in that we struggle to be open and honest about our history. We often would be careful about saying anything that might not be uplifting. That doesn't work. I think that we set our members up to fail if we are not honest about the story. And I don't mean that means we should be critical of people in the past, but I think we should celebrate them when they should be celebrated. And if there are things that we have done in our past that we believe to be mistakes, we should repent and learn from that and not hide it.
Right. Okay, I like that. Moving on from that, what do you feel are some of the key lessons the church has already learned from the past?
So I think there's lots and lots and lots, and I'm finding new ones all the time. From Nauvoo, I think a really important lesson is that community building that focuses inward versus outward is threatening to neighbors. So we did some amazing things here, but we really were looking in, not engaging with the larger community, and it had disastrous consequences.
Right.
In Kirtland, I think things like short-term personal sacrifice leads to long-term community gain. And we saw that lived out in Kirtland as people lived in what was described as a grotesque assemblage of hovels and shanties and small houses, few of which were fit for human habitation, so that they could build the temple. The women of the church were described as giving up even the necessaries of life in order to build the temple. And that phrase, necessaries of life, in the 1830s meant adequate food, clothing, and shelter. Now that kind of pains me that the children didn't have enough to eat, but the people knew that if they invested in this building, which in itself makes me uncomfortable, but they knew that if they invested in this building, that when they were done, they would have a place not just to worship, but a place to educate their children, which would break the cycle of poverty so many were trapped in. And Sidney Rigdon, now he's talking about the Far West Missouri temple, which didn't get built, but it applies to Kirtland as well. He said, we're tired of our people being taken advantage of. We're going to use the temple to teach them to read and write so they can take care of themselves. So I love that idea of education as empowerment. Another lesson from the past. There's a lot more, but that's a beginning.
Sure. No, that's great. Thank you. Related to that, how has our corporate church history / heritage shaped us?
So I think in powerful and profound ways, but we often don't realize it. I think that maybe the first thing that comes to mind is that because we were the dissenters, we were the people who refused to follow Brigham Young and some of the 12 West, we are comfortable with dissent, at least in most of our history. I think we might have almost overreacted as we began swabbling about women in the priesthood and got kind of uncomfortable with dissent. But I think for the most part, we've been pretty comfortable with it. So this idea of doing things by common consent the idea that I can question a decision that a leader makes, the idea that we have the opportunity for faithful disagreement. Even if the church reaches a decision, I can disagree. I just need to do it in private conversations versus public ministry. But I think that our experience as dissenters has shaped the church in powerful ways. And I especially sense that as I interact with members of other traditions, other Latter-day Saint traditions, that ended up shaped in other ways because they were not the dissenters, for example. Some of the other traditions are all about obedience and following the prophet, which is not us. Not us.
No.
I think when the prophet speaks, the conversation has just begun, which is different in some other traditions.
Indeed, it is. Absolutely. Now, you spoke a few minutes ago about some of the pruning you've been doing with shrubs and trees and the gardens around various places. I'd like you to speak a little bit. We talked about your role as director of the history team, but your other role, historic site director. And let's maybe look at this, before COVID or beyond COVID. What is the responsibilities that you have as the director of all of our historic sites?
So we have sites in Nauvoo, Kirtland, Plano, Illinois, Liberty Hall at Lamoni, Iowa, and Heritage Plaza in Independence, Missouri, which is just north of the auditorium. So it's Frederick Madison Smith's little 1830s brick cabin, and the Jones Flournoy house, which is also an 1830s brick cabin. Flournoy is the guy that sold us the 63-acre temple lot in the early 1830s. Those are the sites. Most of them are staffed entirely by volunteers, and so it's providing support for those volunteers. Some of them are staffed mostly by volunteers, but have paid team leads. So that's true in Kirtland and Nauvoo. So it would be meeting regularly with those team leads, working on things like museum store, like training the interpreters, but a lot of it is maintenance. We have maintenance staff in both Kirtland and Nauvoo, although the Kirtland position is open at the moment. So working on budgets and prioritizing repairs, trying to make sure, and I'm not mechanical, so I don't do this, but making sure we have the equipment we need to be more efficient. Sometimes it's securing funding from donors for maintenance projects. Sometimes it's working with the RV Association on project lists so that when they come to the sites, they can be most efficient. Recruiting interns for the summer, training those interns, following tours to make sure they are doing okay. Kind of all of those things. Something we're doing more and more of, and we experienced this, I think, last year. We were able to tour Kirtland Temple with a 3D model. So in the last month, we have a generous donor who has purchased that same camera. And then one of our interns has learned how to use it. So we have just scanned the Plano Stone Church, the homestead, the red brick store. We're about to do the mansion house. We're about to do the Nauvoo house. And then we'll do Liberty Hall as soon as this young person makes it to Graceland this fall. So we're going to be able to do that same kind of tour experience using these 3D models in the not too distant future. So I'm really excited about that
Right.
Distance won't be a problem.
That's awesome.
It is, if you wanted to, you could actually put on the virtual reality goggles
Wow.
and walk through. So it's pretty exciting.
That's amazing. Wow. Now you mentioned the historic sites that we actually have. Thank you. I was actually going to ask you that specific question to give us a rundown, but you already did that. But my next question kind of related to that. Which of our historic sites would you say has the most meaning for you on a personal level?
Wow.
If
I
you
rarely,
want to give more than one, that's fine.
yeah, I rarely say that's a good question, unless it's really a good question. But that's a pretty good question because I've never been asked it before, and I do think it also kind of depends on the day. Um, it's hard to beat Kirtland. I just love the beauty of the space, the peace of the place. You know, it is the foundations for what we understand temples to be used for. I just love telling that story. Love being in Kirtland. Love living there for 15 years. Um, but I also love the peace of Nauvoo, and particularly the Smith family cemetery, which I think is puzzling because it was not peaceful in the 1840s. This was not a peaceful place. Lots of conflict. You know, there's kind of the public Nauvoo story and the private Nauvoo story, and the private Nauvoo story is painful and difficult to tell sometimes. Um, but I love the place. Um, I do think that Liberty Hall is our best restoration, and simply because of some family connections that I love that site. Um, but then again, my parents, as a young married couple, lived in what we call the F.M. Smith study.
Oh,
So
wow.
that's kind of a close connection. Now that was
Sure.
before it was moved to that place. Um, so you know, I feel a sense of connection for lots of reasons to many of these places.
Right.
But it is hard to beat Kirtland.
I remember being there a few years ago for the spiritual formation weekend, and you were kind enough to give me a tour, and I could sense your passion and your excitement for it. And I agree. Kirtland is just it's special. It truly is. Um, can studying church history can studying church history be exciting? Are there moments when you're like, I can't wait to share this with the world or with someone? Can it be exciting?
I think it's incredibly exciting to find a new source that either nobody has seen before or in a long, long time. To find a new story, we spend a lot of time. So when we're doing tours at historic sites, our goal is simply to tell the story openly and honestly and in a gracious or non-threatening manner. But we also, and this is kind of uncomfortable because I think of myself as an amateur historian, so it's kind of uncomfortable to say this, but we also, not on a tour setting, so in a worship setting or a Sunday school setting, we want to use history to support the current mission of the church. So we spend a lot of time finding stories that link to enduring principles or mission initiatives. And there is a lot of evidence, you know, scientific evidence that storytelling works
Hmm.
to help build identity and to help people build understanding. So I think that one of the most effective things that I can do is learn and tell stories to propel people forward in mission. And if I was going to sit down and write a foundational story for the church, I don't think I could write a better one to support current mission than the story we inherited, the one that comes naturally.
Sure.
So, so yeah, I think it's incredibly exciting um, and empowering and at times emotional.
I can I can appreciate that for sure. Absolutely. Thanks. Log, something that I'm sure that perhaps many of our members and viewers are not aware of is that some years ago, the church published a list of church history principles. Can you share with us a little about their purpose and why the church felt the need to adopt those church history principles?
Yeah, um, I think part of it was to help us get ready for Mark Shear's books. I think that might have been part of it.
Interesting. Okay.
I was not in this role then, but I think that might have been part of it. And I think it was simply inviting us to engage more faithfully in the history process. And so things like one that we are terrible at right now, by we meaning the larger cultures. It cautions, for example, against presentism, which I see a whole lot of going on these days. We have a tendency to judge the people of the past by our current understandings about what is appropriate and what is not appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's unfair. And I'm not particularly interested in judging the people of the past. I want to understand them. And if I do that in context, it often helps me not judge, but empathize. I get why they were making those decisions, even if I think they were terrible decisions in some cases. I understand why they were making them. And I'm not gonna, here's a good example. We reaffirm in 1865 the 1830s position of the church to ordain black men. So is that a good thing in 1865 to reaffirm that, or not? So I think that, as that's right as the U.S. Civil War is ending, it's ripped this nation apart. I think it was really brave to do that. Now, there is qualifying language saying, don't rush into it. And I know people who are upset that it said, don't rush into it.
Right, yeah.
Well, we said the same thing in 1984 when we decided to ordain women. Don't rush into it. Let's give folks a little time. The Joseph III revelation, I think, also talks about he talks about priests. Well, I think he understood priest to mean priesthood, that black men could be ordained to priesthood offices, but other members of the church thought it should just mean the office of priest. I don't think that's what Joseph III meant, but he was a pragmatist. I think he thought, well, that's forward progress. If that's a step, then let's take that step. But I know other people who see that as segregationist and that it's horrific. Well, I think racism is horrific, but I also think that was a pretty brave and progressive move in 1865. So I think presentism might cause me to say that's awful and racist. Well, I think there are elements that are racist by our standards, but not by the standards of 1865 in the U.S. I think they were doing pretty well. The church history principles encourage us to kind of see people as they really are, as far as we can tell through the history, and that the story is more believable when we see both the wonderful and the painful and difficult. It's more believable, not less. So we're not setting these people up on pillars, and then when they fall, they're destroyed. The church history principles also make it clear that the foundation of our faith is not Joseph Smith and the history of the church in the 1830s, as Jesus Christ.
Sure.
So I have friends from other faith traditions who see these church history principles and love them. And then when I tell them that President Vesey created them, they're just amazed. He's not a professional historian, but I think he did a really amazing job, and he was kind enough to invite input. But I just think they're really helpful in encouraging us to address our past openly and honestly and not judgmentally. Let's celebrate what should be celebrated. Let's repent when we should repent.
Right. Okay. Well, that takes me to my next question, which is the second church history principle opens with the words, "History informs, but does not dictate our faith and beliefs." Why is that important?
I think that's important because there probably was a time when our history became our theology. And there are others in our faith tradition where I think that's still the case. If something was believed or said or done at a particular time, that becomes not just the history, but the theology of the church. And that's a problem. So I think we need to be able to look at the history. Sometimes it's going to align well with our theology. Sometimes it's not, and that's okay. We ought to be able to recognize that. So I think that's a really important statement.
Right. And I agree, absolutely. Another, as I was reading these principles in preparation for our interview, another one that struck me as very interesting was the fourth one, which states in part, the study of church history is a continuing journey. If we say that a book on history is the only true telling of the story, we risk canonizing one version, a tendency that we have shown in the past. And I have actually encountered that myself. I have seen people reject someone teaching a history class because they said something about one of our older history books, perhaps in a non-flattering way, and they were offended because they didn't like a history book from their childhood being perhaps questioned. And so they refused to have anything more to do with this particular church history instructor. So I have seen people canonize, as the principle says, books of history. How do we help people understand that it is okay to have a new standing of older history books, even while continuing to cherish them as precious books from our individual formative years?
So I think that's where we sometimes have failed. Instead of looking at, for example, Inez Smith Davis's The Story of the Church in context, I think she did a really nice job at the time and place, and that's the way people did history at the time, or many. Sometimes I think we have forgotten that, and as we have become more professional in our methodologies, it's caused us to sometimes almost ridicule efforts in the past. I don't think that's helpful. I think we ought to recognize the nice job she did for the time and place and build on it. I think it's really important to help people learn to think historically, and I think we're failing at that in the larger culture. So that, history is, I think most of our listeners know, maybe is not what happened. It is our attempt to reconstruct what happened based on the best sources that we can find. So I put something together based on the best sources I can find. I put it out there. Tomorrow, I find another source, and it turns upside down everything I thought I knew. And that means I have to start over and create a new understanding. That's the way history works, but that's really challenging and frustrating for some people. There isn't just a version of the story with the church's stamp of approval, and that's the way it is. That's just not the way it works. And I think a good example of that is the way we have understood things like Joseph Smith and polygamy through the years. We start thinking he did it, but he repented and we should forgive him. And then after a number of generations, we evolved into a place where we knew he didn't do it, didn't have anything to do with it. And then in more recent generations, some of our members have shifted back to, I think he did it, or, I have friends that think I'm nuts, but I actually think, yeah, I think he did it, but there's pretty good evidence that he repented, and I think he should be forgiven. Maybe that's a theological question, but there's pretty good evidence that he was involved and that he was trying to get it stopped prior to his death. But I have people who won't even consider that position because they think it's apologetic. Well, no, I just think that's kind of where the sources I'm finding point. But it's hard to convince people of that. But the way the church's position has, and I say the church's position, but that's not true. The church doesn't take positions on historical matters.
Right.
But the way church members have understood Joseph's interactions with polygamy through the years has evolved really drastically. So I'm not trying to convince anybody to believe as I do. And I think there are pretty good sources to support the idea that he didn't do it. In fact, they're so good that there's a huge number of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints these days who believe he didn't do it, which is really awkward when I find myself in a position where I'm saying, well, there are these other sources, so suddenly the roles are reversed. we've spent
That's
generations
ironic.
trying to clear Joseph, and I'm saying, well, maybe he didn't do it because he said he didn't repeatedly, but here's these other sources. So it's just a really complex issue, and you can't land on one position and hold it. We're always trying to learn more and develop better understandings.
Right, absolutely. And part of your response about how people react is a great segue to my next question, which is something that I've found myself wondering for years and years, and I'm just curious if you have any thoughts yourself from your own experiences and encounters with people. But why do some people seem to somehow feel threatened by new approaches to history, theology, doctrine, interpretations, or even positions?
That's another really good question. I don't think I have a good answer, but I do think that for some people, change of any kind is very uncomfortable. And I do think that as a denomination, we've not always done a good job of giving people sources or materials or tools to process change. So the example that immediately comes to mind is women in priesthood, which almost felt like a disruption from everything we had taught in the past when it's introduced in 1984. But when you start drilling down into our history, there's pretty good evidence that Joseph gave women priesthood, starting with Emma, the elect lady, ordained to share scripture, to Joseph in the Relief Society in 1840s Nauvoo, turning the key, which means authority, to the women. He says, I'm going to make you a society of priests and teachers. To when Emma's counselors are ordained, somebody says, well, why aren't you going to ordain Emma? And Joseph says, well, she already was in 1830, back with that elect lady revelation, section 24. And there are multiple patriarchal blessings or evangelist blessings from the 1840s where they reference women holding priesthood authority. That doesn't mean the priesthood offices that we think of, which are kind of appendages to the priesthood, but somehow they had this understanding that women are given priesthood authority in the 1840s. Fred M. Smith in 1919 and again in the 1930s is saying, maybe we should talk about women in priesthood, this order of Dorcas. What does that mean? So we have engaged with that throughout our history, but I think that most people in the 1980s, when we were having those raging debates, had no idea of that discussion. So I think at times we've not equipped people to process change. We did a much better job as we talk about the name of the church, or we talk about the role of our LGBTQ friends in the church, a much better job of helping them have tools to process change.
Right. We've seen that, as you mentioned, with those two examples. And another one that I just thought of was membership conditions. The church went through a whole year process of trying to inform us about all the history behind membership status and stuff. So I think you're right. We're doing a better job of that now for sure. Can you tell us a little bit about the John Whitmer Historical Society? What is that?
Yeah. So that is started 50 years ago next year by a group of folks that are interested in church history. There had been a similar organization started called the Mormon History Association, but as the name suggests, a lot of their focus is on Mormon history, and these people wanted something that would focus more specifically on our LDS history and the history of other smaller groups, the Strangites, Cutlerites, Whiteites, Reedonites, etc. And so they got together, and it's a wonderful organization. They just come together once a year and share papers. They publish a journal several times a year. Really nice organization. And at times the church has, I don't want to say use, but kind of used them to float challenging topics like Dick Howard's paper on Joseph Smith and polygamy, I think, first shows up in a John Whitmer journal. A way to kind of put it out there. It's not official. Let's just get a conversation started. Just by chance, Kristen, my spouse, is the incoming president of the John Whitmer Historical Association.
Oh, wow. Well, congratulations to her.
Yeah.
What would you say in today's world, what do you feel the message of the church, Community of Christ, is?
So this is going to sound antiquated, but I'm all about Zion, building the peaceable kingdom or commonwealth of God on earth. And I think that has been the compelling message for a long time, although at times as world politics have changed, we've gotten uncomfortable with using the word Zion. I don't really care what we call it. This idea that that it's the kingdom of God on earth that we are called to build. I preached this morning, I think I mentioned in Colorado, and the text was John. And I talked a lot about how for John, it's all about Jesus as divine and salvation and eternal life. But the synoptics are not about that. They are about this coming kingdom of God. And that is what speaks to me. It's what converted my Danish grandfather. He devoted his life to this cause of Zion. I love the idea that we can make a difference by being the hands and feet of Jesus here and now. I'm comfortable with the idea that I don't know what is next. But what I do know is that there are a lot of hurting people right here in my community, my neighborhood, and I maybe could do something to make their lives a little better. I think that is the message of Community of Christ, and I love those Paul Jones quotes. The guy that taught at St. Paul's, ended up a Trappist monk, who talks about that is what we have to share with the world. That is the message of Community of Christ, that we can build the kingdom here and now, that Zion can be made real. That is something others need to hear and help us share.
It's great that you actually mentioned Zion, because my next two questions are about Zion. And they are, what does Zion mean to you? And you did touch a little bit on that, but if you want to expand on what Zion means to you. And then the other question I had about Zion is, how do we establish Zion?
So let me start with the second question first. How do we establish it? In very small increments. One good deed today and another one tomorrow. And I don't think this is about salvation. I'm not talking about works. I'm not doing it for any selfish reasons. But I do think that it's because the problems of the world are so immense that we have to start small as individuals. And it could be as simple as a note to a friend who's struggling. It could be as simple as a donation to my local food bank. It could be as complex as starting a food bank. It could be as simple as pulling together a group of people to clean up the Mississippi River and pull the trash out of it, sacredness of creation. So I have this idea that if we can all pick an enduring principle or a mission initiative that we are passionate about, and then gathers others in our community that share that passion, and we can go to Center Place, Beyond the Walls, or other worship experiences to be fed, and then the energy that I would be putting in to put together another sermon, or that everybody's putting in to put together the worship services and all their little congregations. If all those little congregations are instead one big online or in-person congregation, all that energy, all those resources then can be released and funneled towards these passions that we have. And I just have this vision, and we've talked about it in church leadership. Maybe it's like the solar system, where maybe Jesus is the sun, and maybe we have these congregations that are like planets. Then we have these small, what would I call them? Mission expressions, again, based on enduring principles or mission initiatives, that are kind of in the orbit of congregations. If they need sacramental ministry, they can reach out to that congregation. But really, it's a new way of being the church by living out our passion for particular ministries in the places we're at, I think maybe in this time and place, that might be a way of building Zion. And I got to say, I don't know that we'll ever achieve the goal. What is meaningful to me is the pursuit of the goal.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, that's great. We're actually nearing the end of our time, but I do want to ask you another question, which is actually a question that I ask everyone that I interview. What gives you hope for the future of the church?
So I feel like I actually had was it last year, 2 years ago, because I did the circuit of Mission Center conferences. My opening line of the sermon was, "These are the best of times and these are the worst of times." And it's true. You know, we have these financial challenges that we're working towards meeting.
Sure.
And I love the book Beyond Resistance that we've spent a lot of time with in the church over the last few years. And it talks about the impact of postmodernism on religion in North America. It really is looking at the US, but I think a lot of it applies. And the challenges that is creating. You know, I see things like, well, people are, they don't believe in universal truths. They are nervous about membership. They are suspicious of authority. We've trained our kids to learn in little incremental pieces of information as they flash across the screen, and then we wonder why they don't want to sit and listen to me talk for 20 or 25 minutes in a sermon. If we have kids that are in the church, we're so mobile that they move across the world, so we're not able to grow our congregations naturally that way. But when I start looking at a lot of the challenges facing Christianity, courtesy of postmodern religious thought, then I look at where Community of Christ fits. I think we are extraordinarily well positioned to be a home, even though we got to figure out the membership thing, to be a home for religious refugees at this time. I think that our polity and our beliefs, the way that we see the world, really positions us very well. And ironically, a lot of the challenges that we had, things like mobility and people moving away, well, courtesy of the pandemic, now it doesn't matter if the kids move away. I'm seeing a lot of our congregations that had 10 active participants suddenly have 30.
Wow.
Because everybody who moved away is back again on Sunday morning, courtesy of Zoom. So, you know, I'm not saying there are not major challenges, but I really think that Community of Christ is extraordinarily well positioned for the future.
That is very awesome to hear. That and very optimistic. That's a great way, I think, to go our separate ways. But Locke, thank you so much for your willingness to be with us and to support us again, like you did last year. And I'm sorry we still haven't been able to have you up at Noronto in person. Have you ever been to Camp Noronto?
I have not, and I'm desperately looking forward to it.
Well, that's good to know. We'll make sure that we get you up there one day. It's a beautiful spot. It is the best campsite in the entire world. But
aren't they all?
I might be a bit biased, but Joseph Smith didn't actually do all that stuff in Palmyra. It was actually at Camp Noronto. But you know, we Canadians, we're so polite. We don't want to brag about that. But
don't burst my bubble.
Yeah. So thank you, Locke. Thank you for being with us. We maybe take ourselves off of mute so we can all thank Locke and say our farewells. Oh.
Well, thank you very much, Locke and David, for a fascinating hour. I remind everybody that you can go to go.camping.ca for the complete calendar of upcoming Noronto Reunion and other camping events, as well as their Zoom links. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you Thursday for the next Noronto Wants to Know during the 7 o'clock worship service, when David's special guest will be Tony Shabella Smith.
Woohoo. All right.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye,
everyone.
thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, folks, and I hope to see you in person soon.
Thank you.
That was great.
Well done. Great questions, David.
Thank you very much. Glad you
Thank
enjoyed
you.
it.
Thank you, David.
You're welcome. Take care, everyone.